Hello. Well, good evening. I think we're just gonna get it started. Good evening, MOCA friends. Hi. Sorry, I just saw answer my friend. I was like, but my name is Yifan Wu. I use didn't pronounce. I'm the director of programs and chief of staff at the Museum of Chinese in MOCA. So it is my pleasure to welcome you all to this very special conversation with Mimi Kiwa, author of the best-selling memoir, House of Kiwa. And then, Kiwa, a journalist and news anchor for two decades. And then she's actually, coming all the way from Melbourne, Australia. In her book, reveals a life behind the camera that is far stranger than anything she has reported on. Because when her own father, Francis, sued her, you are really look deep into her rich family history to understand her complicated relationship with him. Colorful and often darkly humorous House of Kiwa, it is an epic story spanning 4 generations of the Kiwa family. Throughout her journey, Kiwa finds inspiration in her father's late old sister, the jet-setting and free spirit Aunt Theresa, whose extraordinary life served as a beacon of hope. So, and it would really, we'll get into the sort of the, her families and then, the books that, as part of the conversation. Then, if you do enjoy tonight's program, please consider purchasing the book. We're selling it for $16, which is cheaper than Amazon and tax free. And then the most important thing, after the book, you can get it, autographed. And then we do accept, cash, credit card, Venmo, and PayPal. So please, if you enjoy the book, please consider, purchasing the book, but also consider supporting the museum. Really, your support will allow us to create more programs like this. And as you know, we're just kicking off our sort of the fall programming. We have, a full lineup of events coming up, more like MOCA Talks, MOCA Mid-Autumn festivals, other mixers, and then we have a new exhibition opening in a few weeks on Asian American periodicals. So, if you haven't followed us on Instagram or social media or newsletters, please do. And actually, for our live participants, because we're live streaming the program, we also encourage you to submit questions anytime during the discussion for the Q&A. And this event is also being recorded for on-demand viewing on our YouTube channel. And then, well, this is how the programs will go. We will have a conversation at the end. And maybe we'll do a, kind of a reading, of some, from the book. And then, of course, with the Q&A, after Q&A, we're able to have a book signing, to, meet and greet with her, and then she can definitely sign your book. And once again, thank you for joining us tonight. As we explored a deeply personal journey of surviving against the odds and really striving, through adversity. So without further ado, I'm gonna kick off our conversation with this key. Why would a father sue her own daughter? I think that's a lot of, when you read that,
question, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I'll sort of give you a bit of a, before I explain that, I'll just give you a bit of an overview. I think David, lovely overview of the book, but the book begins with me receiving the documentation from my father showing that he was suing me in the Supreme Court in Australia. And my hair went grey overnight, almost as grey as my husband's here. And I just had this sprig of grey hair because I was in such shock and I was so mortified and upset that my dad would do that, that I just went into this whole, it just triggered all the cortisol and the fear hormones, and I just blacked out. And the next day when I woke up grey, I thought, wow, this is pretty extraordinary. So I had a bit of a breakdown. My dad, to work out why a father would sue his own daughter, I really excavate the 4 generations that you talk about of the past in my book. And I found that he had 32 brothers and sisters. And he grew up in Hong Kong during the Japanese occupation of Hong Kong during the Second World War. And one of the 32 brothers and sisters was my auntie, my Aunt Theresa. And the reason my dad sued me, to answer your question, is because my auntie left me in charge of her estate when she died. And it wasn't that she was leaving everything to me, she was actually leaving everything to him, or most of her estate to him. But being a Chinese man, he didn't like the idea that a woman, particularly his daughter, was in charge of anything. So that just made him very, very angry and upset. And he would send me text messages and letters saying, I am the king, you know, how dare you? And I hadn't asked for the job. And my auntie, in her will, said, and she definitely did not want him in charge, because in her will, it was like, if anything happened to me, then she had this list of about 10 other people. Oh. And my dad wasn't on it.
Okay, wow.
So that's why he sued me.
Oh my God. Also, before we kind of like really delve into even your relation with your father, so but seem credible.
It's a great question. I've got a good story that goes with that, if it's okay. So when the book came out, so the book took me 5 years to write. And my husband and I have 4 children, and I work, as you can mention, I was a newsreader, a television newsreader in Australia for 20 years and a journalist. And so I had a career, I had 4 children, and my dad suing me. Once that case was sort of resolved, I was writing the book as therapy, really, for myself to just still come to terms with my relationship with my dad. When the book came out in Australia during the pandemic in Melbourne, I don't know if you heard that Melbourne was the most locked down city in the world. And so for pretty much 2 years, we were in lockdown. And the book came out, HarperCollins signed me, and that was very exciting. And then I had the choice, do I still want to put the book out during the pandemic? Because it's going to be, I won't be able to do a book tour, I won't be able to do signings. Anyway, we went ahead and put the book out. I was just in my little bubble at home with my husband and my 4 kids. They were all homeschooling. I forgot that the book was actually coming out anywhere other than my suburb, And my dad lives across 4 hours on a plane across the other side of the country in a city called Perth in Australia. And what I didn't count on was him finding out that I'd written books. I told you. And the ABC, which is the national broadcaster in Australia, they actually put a television advertisement on, which was this beautiful animation of the dragon and the tiger and photos of my dad and the 32 brothers and sisters. My dad messaged me and he said, no, he called me and left a message and he said, Mr. Wong down the road says I'm on television. And I said, oh, I think maybe it's my friends at the ABC. I've written a bit of a book. It's nothing. When lockdown finishes, I'll come over, I'll sit down with you and we can read it together. And I said, whatever you do, don't buy it. So the next day I got a message and he said, "Bought the book, very expensive, and it's a load of rubbish." And I was like, ooh, and my heart sort of beating because I'm getting all of those feelings again. Court, and I was starting to stress because I thought, oh no, he's going to sue me, he's going to sue the publisher. And so I wrote back and I said, how much have you read, Dad? And he said, I'm up to page 17. And I was like, oh. So over the next couple of weeks, I was just in this state of hypervigilance and, sort of dissociation. And he kept messaging me saying things like, this bit's rubbish and this bit's very Harry Potter's. And anyway, at the end of the conversation, I finished the book. He said, you should have mentioned all of the court cases that I won. And I think that our ancestors would be proud. Oh, I know. And I was like, so then I screenshotted the message and I sent it to my publisher. And I said, he's not going to sue us. We're off the hook.
Right. I think for now, well, I mean, I think right. I think at the end of it, right? Maybe he understood, its way of, like you said, right, it's a your way of kind of healing process. Even just when you receive the letter, and finally put some kind of closure to it as you also uncover your history. And then, so the next question, actually, I'm gonna, since you mentioned that, he has a hobby of suing people.
He does.
And then, and then which means, also in the book, right, kind of describe your childhood really as kind of difficult, right? Really growing up as a mother suffering from mental illness and your dad just kind of constantly suing people, right? And then so how did this kind of experience kind of shape you personally and professionally?
Well, it made me feel quite litigious growing up because I had this role model, my dad, who was suing people just for looking at him pretty much. Like he sued a neighbour for having a boulder, like a rock that was 20 centimetres, not even 20, it was like 2 centimetres over the boundary. And he reversed his Volvo vehicle into the rock by accident and he blamed the neighbour. And the rock had been there for 20 years. So it was my dad's bad driving, but he sued the neighbour successfully. Like he won.
What?
A car accident, but he won. The boulder was, on his property technically, which was a bit ridiculous. So things like that, and he would sue pharmaceutical companies, and he would sue all sorts of people. So all of the magistrates and all of the judges in the courts, they all knew my dad. And when I went to do work experience well, I guess I wasn't litigious by nature, but I had this, I guess this skepticism, this healthy, maybe unhealthy skepticism just about right, wrong, having seen my dad. My dad would ask me to send, like, if the police turned up at our house or people came serving legal documents, I would have to answer the door and lie to them and say, oh no, my dad's not here. So I was taught by him almost in some ways not to respect authority and not to play by the rules, which I later did play by the rules. Anyway, when I was in high school, I did work experience at the Supreme Court. And one of the staff came up to me and said, Mimi Kwan, are you related to Francis Kwan? And I said, oh, yes, that's my dad. And I was just completely oblivious to why they knew him, didn't quite realise. And the person said, oh, he's a vexatious litigant. And I said, oh, yes. I didn't know what the word vexatious meant. And it is. Know him. And then I went and looked up the word and I went, oh. And then when I met my husband, John, here, John's dad was a magistrate. And so straight away, my dad wanted to get legal advice from John's dad. I did everything possible to try to hide the fact. I didn't tell my dad John's surname because I didn't want my dad to know that I was in a relationship with somebody who had a legal person in their family. And I definitely didn't want John's dad to know.
It's family.
Family.
But just, coincidence, it has to be. What a story. And then I think, before we kind of really go even deeper into your your dad, your mom, but then also, I want to mention, the Aunt Theresa, kind of really in the book, really describe her, right, like a pig in a pod. Also your relationship with her, kind of how she served as inspiration. So yeah, can you actually tell us more about,
yeah, Auntie Theresa was amazing. So
right?
Auntie Theresa was the world's first Chinese air hostess for BOAC, which is now British Airways. So that was a huge accomplishment for a Chinese woman in Hong Kong to get a job with this British carrier. And it was tantamount to being an actress in those days, or a Hollywood movie star, because to get the job, she was literally auditioned with thousands or hundreds, if not thousands, of other women in Hong Kong, and most of the women who were employed at that time when BOAC was recruiting were white women. They were expatriates who were living in Hong Kong. Anyway, Auntie Theresa got a job working for BOAC, for the airline. In those days, in the 40s and 50s, they only would have maybe 15 people on board, and the only people who could afford to fly were very wealthy or dignitaries. Or as Auntie Theresa would say, or private school students. So we're going to London to board, And she said that they were always very naughty because they'd have their pillows on board and they'd have like pillow fights on the plane and she'd have to break it up. I don't think I put that in the book, but I should have. And so she was really, she knew how to behave. She was very, very gentrified. She was friends with, princes and princesses and dignitaries. One of my favourite stories is she was friends with a woman called Lady McMahon, who she became friends with through the airlines, and she and Lady McMahon would go out and they'd go to parties in Hong Kong, and then Lady McMahon said, "When you're in Sydney, come and visit me, come over and have dinner, come and meet my husband." So when Auntie Theresa was on her next long haul from Hong Kong to Australia, she called Lady McMahon and said, let's catch up. Lady McMahon said, "Oh, just so happens my husband's home tonight, I'm home, come over for dinner." So Auntie Teresa's sitting at dinner in their house, she's thinking, this is a nice house, but she's been, to lots of nice places by then. And she leans over to Lady McMahon's husband and says, "And what do you do?" And he said, "I'm the Prime Minister." And she didn't skip a beat and she said, "What's that like?" So she just had such a beautiful way with people. It didn't matter whether you were the prince or the dustman. She treated everybody equally. She also had the first, after she retired from being an air hostess, she had the first shop at the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Hong Kong, which was a very famous hotel there. And she had a beautiful silk shop, and she sold silk and souvenirs there. And the bellhop there, who is now the manager of he's gone from being the bellhop when he was a boy to being the manager of the whole hotel now. I went and saw him after Auntie died. I actually took her ashes to the hotel because I wanted her to have one last swan around. And she sat with me at breakfast and I had the urn next to me at breakfast. People probably thought I was very strange. And I met the manager and he said, "Your auntie was just the kindest woman. As a bellhop, I would, so many people would be rude to me. Even the other staff would be rude to me." And he said, "Your auntie always had time to speak to me and she was always tipping me as well, and she didn't need to." So I just think that was the sort of person she was. And it's so lovely, I think, for any of us, when you hear from somebody else, third hand about somebody who was so special to you, you realise that they were not just special to you, they were special to everybody that they met.
That's why. I mean, of course, I think the world needs more, and I think it is probably, the reason, I think some people ask you, "Oh, you had such, kind of a difficult sort of childhood, but then why, turn out to be, right, sort of, still with kindness, respectful and lovely." I think it was, it's kind of, Auntie Teresa kind of play a role, right, kind of serving as the role model, so then, so it's, yeah, right. So it's so great to hear. I mean, of course, yeah, in your book, written, epic lens about her. And then, but now I think I wanted to, I think the audience will also want to hear more about your family history because, it is really kind of the four generations, right? And, from the imperial compounds in Beijing, right, from the Silk Road and opium road to southern China, across to Hong Kong, right, and then, Teresa's and your dad to, Australia. So then, could you just tell us more about, and then yeah, really kind of your family journey really talks a lot about, wealth, war, immigration, yes.
Well, it's interesting because that's why they call the book epic, because it's covering so much ground. And it has been, HarperCollins calls it Wild Swans Meets Educated. And it's really that sense of the history is like the wild swan side of things. And when I've written it, of course, I don't know everything that happened because I wasn't there. So I've had to go off the stories that my auntie told me and that my dad has told me, and things that I remember that I was told when I was growing up, the little things that you think at the time as a child, oh, it doesn't really mean much to you. 32 brothers and sisters. I just thought, oh, yeah, like it didn't register with me, like how unusual that is, or maybe and how not uncommon it probably was in China at the time, though. So with the history and the epicness of it, I sort of had to condense it as much as as I could to sort of fit in the pages of the book. And what I found so fascinating, I think, was just that thread of survival of, you know, my Chinese family and every Chinese family and every family of every culture and religion around the world. Just history is fascinating. People survive what they come through. And seeing, especially trying to understand my dad and why he would sue his own daughter, seeing in the history books what was going on in Hong Kong during the Second World War and the Japanese occupation, and that really, I don't know about in American classrooms, but in Australian classrooms, that is not a part of history that is covered. It's just not taught. So I grew up in Australia and I didn't even learn about my own history. And I think that's the case for a lot of the diaspora of Asian people throughout the world. When you're living in a Western country, you know, understandably or not understandably, there are certain elements that are just left out of the education, historical education that you get. So it was fascinating for me as an adult to actually look at the history of Hong Kong and the Second World War and understand that my dad was only 7 years old when Hong Kong was occupied for 3 years and 8 months. And when I just sort of scratched at the surface of that and asked my dad questions about that, it was extraordinary. You know, he said, oh, yes, we were bombed 52 times during the 3 years and 8 months. And he, you know, called it the dark period. And, you know, schools were turned into death camps. And it was just, you know, it's an extraordinary time in history for the world. But I think knowing so much about the European experience during the Second World War and the American experience, and not knowing about Hong Kong, I think that's really sad that so many people don't know. And I've actually, even the South China Morning Post did an article on my book and said that this is one of the only books, that non-historical books, that actually deals with that period in history in this way. So I just think it's such a huge privilege to be able to bring something, like so many people have contacted me and said, I didn't know that Hong Kong was occupied during the Second World War. But so many people, I don't know whether Americans.
Yeah, no, I think similarly. Once again, you know, I think we're familiar in once Asian American history, right? You know, hasn't been sort of, you know, sort of highlighted in school, right? I think it's only in recent years, you know, kind of being introduced or trying to go into those kind of the school courses and stuff. And there's an effort. I mean, someone like, you know, New York, of course, right? Like, you know, the Department of Education, you know, being pushing initiatives in really pushing Asian American histories or, you know, cultures into, you know, just public schools. But then, you know, once again, when you go to other states, you know, that really, but also I think there also be national efforts, you know, to really just so that's why I think when we talk about, you talk about the diaspora, right? So that we can see these kind of parallels, sort of migration experience, you know, kind of, you know, the Second World II, you know, really, you know, on the Beijing, you know, once, you know, the people of China, right, kind of over the sort of that exodus of, you know, immigrants, right, from mainland to Hong Kong, and then Hong Kong sort of to the rest of the world, right? You know, some went to, like you did, right, went to Australia, and same, you know, came to America, but then a lot of them even couldn't come to America, you know, relocated to, you know, South America, the Caribbeans, you know, because, right, also during that time, right, as most of us know, right, the Chinese Exclusion Act, you know, they couldn't come in. So then they had to, you know, wait somewhere in between and hoping one day they could come to the country, right, what we call the beautiful country, maybe. But then, you know, but then I do want to kind of, yeah, go back to you, talk a little bit more, but
It's fascinating, even looking through the exhibition here at MOCA, the similarities between the American experience, the Chinese American experience, and the Chinese Australian experience. So much of the racist propaganda that exists, you know, that you've got on the walls here, and the policies and the, you know, the racism and the hatred towards Chinese, like that was really emulated as well in Australia. We had something called the White Australia policy, which was basically exactly what the name means. You know, if you're not white, you can't come in. So for the people that did make it into Australia, including my dad, they were subjected to a lot of racism because there was just this, you know, this myth and suspicion around Asians and Chinese in particular in Australia. And it's extraordinary seeing your exhibition and thinking, gosh, you know, the octopus motive, you know, the metaphor of the octopus that was used in propaganda in Australia as well. You know, anti-Chinese media and advertising. It's interesting that it was obviously happening in Western countries around the world.
Yeah, so that I think that's why I think when we talk about it, I was like, oh, hosting, the talk also makes sense because really you can see it kind of throughout history around, sort of the world, right? Sort of in a more like a Western, sort of and yeah, right. Once again, you mentioned about that white Australian policy. I remember reading, there's also kind of the Australian version of the Exclusion Act, right? So banning, Chinese going into Australia around kind of the turn of the 20th century, right? And then but then I guess I want to talk a little bit more, right, in your book, since you mentioned Richard with your so that specifically, so this kind of turn about the intergenerational trauma, this kind of really recurring theme, right? So how did you really manage to kind of back these kind of heavy emotions?
Therapy.
Therapy. Yeah. But also yourself is also like meditation teacher, right? So yes, how I mean I guess it's kind of a related question. So how has really sort of your practice of mindfulness been coming to play, for people who might be experienced, sort of this intergenerational trauma. Yeah.
Yeah, so something that you touched on earlier that I'll mention, which kind of plays into this whole stew or melting pot of the dysfunctional childhood that I had. And I know that I'm not alone there because I don't think there's a single person who's had a fully functional childhood. But my mum was and is living with acute and chronic schizophrenia. So she had a very extreme mental illness when I was growing up. And so the roles were reversed, really. I was more like a mother to her. So that's why Auntie Theresa was such a really important role model in my life. In terms of where I am now, like currently, now that I'm retired from TV news reading and written the book, I do a lot of public speaking, but I am studying a 2-year course with the University of Berkeley, California, or University of California, Berkeley, whichever way around it goes. And I'm doing that remotely online. It's a 2-year course in mindfulness meditation teaching. And I arrived at that. I mentioned therapy, so I've probably had, almost a decade of therapy around my, relationship with my dad and with my mum. My mum actually lives with me and my husband and 4 children now. We look after her. So I think therapy led me to mindfulness and meditation because even with all of the therapy and all of the different tools that I accumulated with my wonderful psychologist, and I guess she diagnosed me with PTSD really from experiences that I had had growing up and also the recent experience of when my dad sued me. So life was basically going very well, great career, amazing husband, great kids. And my mum was finally well and living with us. So I was as far away from my dad as possible across the other side of the country. So everything was going well. And I hadn't dealt with any of my childhood stuff. And I think that is true for many people. It takes one trigger and then everything, it's like it's a can of worms, then suddenly everything comes up and you've got to deal with that thing that happened when you were 3 and then when you were 5 and then and we spend so much time as humans just pushing things down and bottling things up and keeping a stiff upper lip and moving forward, and that's survival and that's completely understandable and we need to do that sometimes, but we also, I believe, need to face our traumas and our demons in order to heal. And I think healing really is our only purpose as humans. And that's because I've had 10 years of doing some really deep work and getting to the mindfulness meditation. That was the missing key for me. So with all of the other tools, with all of the other methods that I had explored, there was something missing. And once I started meditating and started going down that sort of spiritual path as well, I realized this is what was missing for me in terms of my healing. And so now it's something that I find incredibly supportive on a day-to-day basis, even a moment-to-moment basis. We have a little meditation right here.
And then so that you definitely, yeah, so communicating, right? It's about mindfulness, anywhere, and I think that's also, well, in terms of, going back to kind of the mental health, sort of even in the Asian American, community has been a long time a taboo, kind of, like you said, it's missing that, like, childhood trauma, but then later on, right, because we're just trigger, and then you just.
Hopefully the trigger won't be your dad suing you.
But those monsters eventually they will come out, but instead of, of course, do the meditation, pursue, mental health, sort of, advice and help. And, you can also write a book, I think writing.
Writing books
right.
and I think that's, anyway, we can take questions on the page of it.
Yeah. Well, so then I think, as well, I guess you mentioned more about your mindfulness, but then I kind of wanted to shift kind of direction a little bit, but then I wanted talking of your career and the influence, I think that's also kind of, right, before you kind of, I guess, yeah, kind of more like you're growing up, even throughout your career. But first, really, whether can you share about sort of maybe your extensive career in journalism, how did that kind of influence sort of your approach in writing, because I felt like, the reason, reading through the book is like because with your background in journalism, so just like investigate, sort of, you have the tendency to like, you're probably, because of the ability to even just to, even just through conversations or research, able to really, kind of to unravel those, mysteries and histories, could you share a little bit about that?
Yes, well, an investigative journalist has certainly helped me with writing the book, that's for sure. When I started journalism, I actually became Australia's first Chinese woman, or actually first Chinese person or of Chinese descent on our national network, Channel 9, which doesn't really mean anything to you here, but it was a big deal for me. And just in terms of giving Asian visibility on television, when I had grown up with no images of Asians in the media at all, apart from, I guess, American images of Jackie Chan and
Bruce Lee,
Bruce Lee.
And Wong.
Yes, and it's only like a handful, and then there was also the actress, I don't know, I can't remember her name, but she was Cassandra in Wayne's World, which was an American TV show. And I walk along the street where I grew up, and people call out Cassandra, and it's like, and because there's only one person in the media, so they're just like, oh, you're Asian, so I'm going to call you that name because I don't have any idea of any other Asian because there is no visibility of Asians. So it was really great to be able to do that for, not really for myself, but just visibility for others. And I would have young girls come up to me, young Asian girls, and just be like, oh, I want to do what you're doing one day, because I've got this huge belief that if you can't see it, it's really hard to be it, isn't it? And so that visibility of all cultures and just diversity is obviously being recognised now as being really important in the media. So my career was a bit of a, it was a bit of a roller coaster, but a bit of a dream too. I got to interview Serena Williams, Russell Crowe, John Cleese, lots of big names. And I got to interview some just really interesting, ordinary people too, who were having extraordinary experiences. So in terms of writing the book, I almost had to undo a lot of my journalistic writing, because writing for news is short, pithy, you've got to have the headline, and writing a book, long form, it's a very different style of writing. So whilst the journalistic tendency to just really want to dig deep and get to the bottom of things and get to the truth, or a version of the truth, whilst that was inherent in me, the writing style itself was was challenging. And I remember the first draft of my book, I had a lot more full stops in there. And, you know, one of my first readers said, I think you need to just turn the full stops into commas. And so do you call them commas here as well? Yeah, yeah, yes, yeah. So, period, yes, yeah. Got it. Yeah, so I had too many periods in there, and it'd be like 3 words, period, 3 words, period. And then once I changed them into commas, then it just seemed to flow much more smoothly.
Well, thank you so much for sharing kind of that sort of your writing practice. And then I do want to talk about sort of how you sort of have or have been embracing your mixed race kind of heritage, which you, I think, also being kind of thinking about it, openly, right? So I guess, yeah, I'm just curious, because I think, as I was, reading some articles, especially in the book article, you describe your childhood surrounded by Western doors and stories, right, leading kind of to a feeling of adequate regarding your own appearance, right? So, how did this kind of early experience, sort of shaped, your perception of yourself? How, and I know, of course, later, and then once again, like kind of growing up in Perth in the 70s and 80s, you also kind of talk about like, not other. So how did you, yeah, overcome? Yeah.
It was very unusual in very white populated Perth, where I grew up, in the city I grew up in Australia. It was very unusual to see mixed race people. And in the 70s when I was born, and now obviously there's so many mixed race people everywhere, all around the world, which is wonderful. But for me, my mum, when she was well enough to walk me down the road in the pram, people would ask her whether she'd adopted me or whether she was looking after somebody else's baby. And, they were maybe innocent questions, but I think as I got older and realised I didn't really look like my mum at all, because of course the Asian gene is more dominant, so I had more Asian features. And look, it's arguable now. Some people say that I look like I could be from anywhere. I've been in Greece and people think that I'm Greek. It's very interesting being mixed race, because people can see in you what they recognise perhaps in themselves. So for me, my upbringing, the community that I was in, the school that I was at, where I was the only person of Asian descent at my primary school for a very long time, until somebody else joined, and then there was 2 of us. That experience was that the world was feeding to me that I was Asian, because that's how I looked. And so even though I'm half, and I'm mixed race, I'm half English, half Chinese, I don't know which half, but even though that was technically what I was and what I am, the world would treat me as being Asian and tell me to go home to my own country, or say ching chong chogi and pull their eyes up. And all of these things, as a little girl, you don't understand, you don't understand why people are talking to you in this way. And so then, of course, then you do you become insecure and start self-doubting. So I sort of had that experience in Perth, but thank goodness for Aunt Theresa, because when I went to Hong Kong, she would say, "You're so beautiful." And as I got older, I realized that in Perth, where I was sort of not necessarily regarded by a lot of people as being, attractive or pretty, in Hong Kong, I would have people, when I was a teenager, John probably thinks this is exaggerated, but it's very true. I would have people following me down the street, because they were just either just so curious, but because mixed race, people would say, "Are you a movie star?" Because I think in Hong Kong in those days, that's the look that they were looking for modelling and for
Eurasian.
Yes, that Eurasian look. So it was a very different experience in Australia to when I was in Asia. So I don't know whether I've answered your question, but yes, growing up, that was my experience. And even now, I think I had a lot of white friends, and still do, and because there wasn't really an Asian community where I grew up. And when my dad did send me to Chinese school in Perth, I was sort of ostracized there because I wasn't Chinese enough. So
about this
yeah,
duality, right? No
Yeah.
Chinese enough, but also no white enough.
yeah,
There's a lot of times in these relations, right?
mm,
We feel like like kind of exist in between us, you know.
yes. And even in Australia now, and maybe because I'm seeing a lot of experience through my lens from when I was much younger, but even as a writer in Australia, I'm now considered, I guess I'm a mixed race writer, but then the publisher and people will regard me as a Chinese writer, but other writers in Australia who are Chinese, I'm not in the club because I'm not Chinese enough. So it's just interesting. It doesn't upset me, but I just think, oh, it's very curious that these feelings and ideas are still quite pervasive. They're not articulated or expressed in the same way, but it's interesting.
I do want to leave some time for questions, but then I also have more questions. I'll ask maybe two more questions, but and then maybe with short answers, and then we can open the floor. So really, I think also
Cool with short answers.
yes. Good. Maybe media answers. Okay. So you really describe a touching moment of watching your daughter sing song, represented, on a Netflix show. So how do you see the landscape of representation, especially maybe for the mixed race kind of communities, evolving for the next generation, in Australia, and what does this really mean,
I've actually written quite a bit about this. That must be the Vogue article maybe that you're referring to. But I've written quite a bit around this for different publications because what is really good in Australia, and I presume that it's been happening probably in America because everything happens here first and then we follow, is that when I go for castings or my daughters go for castings, so I've been in quite a few TV series playing myself just as a newsreader, and for American TV series too. I'm in The Preacher, and in Australia I'm in quite a few that you may not have heard of, but The Clearing as well. It's another one that I'm in. Anyway, my point being is that when they're casting their talent, they now specify that they want multicultural talent, which I think they're not necessarily specifying Eurasian talent or mixed race talent, but it's such a huge step in the media landscape to be actually seeing it printed on the page, saying that this is open to all ethnicities for TV roles, and I just think that's great. So I think that there has been progress, and things have come a long way, and yet there's a lot of study that shows that there's still a long way to go. When you do break it down by race, and then there's gender and ability, and that there's all sorts of things. So diversity is something that we hear a lot about. Some people are tired of hearing about it, but I think the pendulum does need to swing the other way a little bit before it eventually balances out for everyone.
I think you might be kind of similar in Australia too, right? Because we right now we also hear right kind of the surge of Asian American actors or even TV series, right? We see a lot of being adapted on the screen. Once again, there's more can be done, right? Because once because that also comes into the question, when you talk about Hollywood, right? It's who are those people in power? The producers, the directors, casting directors, but also just also the stories, right? And then there's there should be more stories like this. They should be written, adapted, actually. So so Mimi's book, it's actually good, will be adapted onto the screen. So but can you tell us more? Yeah. About it.
It's in the very early stages,
okay.
but it is very exciting to see it all come together and to have that, having read the news for so long, I'm used to one part of the media where, be in a studio with a camera, read the news, and that's a very privileged and fun experience. It's all I ever wanted to do. Now I'm having these other experiences on movie sets, when I'm playing myself in these TV series, and now there's yet another experience where the book is now in a writer's room, and there are 8 or 9 writers who are then adapting it to a screenplay, and that's so interesting. Like, life is just, it's amazing. There is so much to learn, and the more I learn, the more I realise there is to learn. So in terms of the writing process for screen, it's in the very early stages. There's something called a Bible they create, there's a pilot, all of these things. But probably as Americans, you know all about this. But
No, I don't think we are, that's something I can tell us more. I mean, I don't think, yeah, it was good to hear that, your stories being that, which means because, 'cause it's resonating, right? With people and then the readers.
more Asian visibility as well, and also a bit of visibility for kind of mixed race experience. So actually, when the writers came back to me the first time, so I sort of consult on some of the documentation that they're putting together at the moment. When they had a photo, they sort of put photos in there. They said, "Oh, handsome husband." So John was happy about that. And then, but they had a photo of an Asian woman, a Chinese woman, presumably, and she wasn't mixed race. And I said, I really feel that the photo represented in this presentation that you're giving needs to show a mixed race actor, because it's my life story. So I think, yeah, so it'll be interesting how that goes, because I've kind of signed over the rights to it. So that's yes. She might be amazing.
Something that in addition to this rotation, what's next? What's new? Another book? Any upcoming projects?
Yes, so I'm working on another book. So this is, of course, my Asian heritage that I focus on with House of Kwa. The next book is about my British heritage. So on my British side of the family, my grandfather was a spy during the Second World War. So while the Hong Kong experience was going on with the Asian side of my family, on the British side, my grandfather was parachuting into enemy territory and rescuing US pilots, actually, who had been shot down by the Germans, and he was helping to ferry them through the Belgium and the French resistance to get them to safety. So he was a spy and an intelligence officer. He would literally go undercover in enemy territory and dress in German suits, and it's just, it makes my hair stand on, I get goosebumps, because he just had such incredible wartime adventures that he told me about. And I grew up half the week with, he was sort of my stand-in dad, because my dad, anyway, you'll read about my dad if you read about him, but there's more to that story. But yeah, so the next book is about the British side of the family, and actually a little bit about my identity too, and how, I was able to still have this very strong relationship with my white British grandparents and with that identity, whilst the world was still treating me as Chinese. So yeah, so that's an exploration that I'm working on at the moment.
And then hopefully published in a couple of years, right? Okay, good. It's another epic story. But I was like, oh wow, I feel, like both books together, it should be. I feel, it's like it's a series, that I can really.
Nelson, you trilogy, because I've actually written the third book before I've written the second book, but the third book is the third, because the third book, I'm calling, well, the working title is Tiger Lotus, and the third book is really about my healing journey and all the therapy and finding meditation. So that has been a work in progress as well. But I think that needs to be third, because that would make sense. And odd numbers are lucky in Chinese, I think.
Yeah, I mean, of course, like fours or others you're looking six or eight, it could be a whole series. Yeah, pretty cool, all right, well, I do want to open the floor, for questions. Also, our live participants, if you do have any questions, please use the chat or Q&A to submit your questions. And then if there's any questions in the audience, feel free to raise your hand, and I would, okay.
Your story is absolutely fascinating. I have a question, quick comment, and then a little longer question for you. First question, your father has 32 brothers and sisters, all the same parents?
Same father, 3 different wives, but at the same time, because polygamy was not uncommon in China. And what's amazing to me is that it's only one generation ago. It's like my dad's, it's not like this is like ancient ancestors of mine.
Wow. Well, saying I collect foreign coins and foreign currency, so I found it when you mentioned about Hong Kong being overrun by the Japanese during World War II, I have paper money from World War II from the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia with the Japanese insignia on it. But I didn't know about Hong Kong, so I think even here it's not as well known as some of the other situations in Asia. And then last, I know here in America, and I've been to Australia a couple of times. I haven't been to Perth, but I've been to Sydney and Melbourne. Um, Here in America, in the Asian community, there's been tremendous success. And then also right here in Chinatown, my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, uh, there are segments that are some of the poorest populations in America. Is that the same in Australia these days, where you
Yes.
have a very wide range of the Chinese diaspora?
Yeah, absolutely. That is the same.
And you grew up in the middle, it sounds like, or how did?
Yes, yeah, I grew up in the middle, and it does give me an opportunity to mention when I grew up with my dad actually had the biggest backpackers in the Southern Hemisphere. So we had 100 people sleeping over at my house every night. So it wasn't just kind of in the middle, it was in a bit of a crazy middle. Yeah. Thanks for your questions.
Hi, thank you for coming all the way from Australia.
Pleasure.
So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about big picture wise about your healing journey, and sort of how it ties in with your writing journey. Did you start writing before, during? Do you feel that the healing journey has changed your writing and themes and your perspective?
Yes, yes to all of the above. There is an expression, I don't know if you've heard of it, is all you have to do is sit at your typewriter and bleed. And there you got your book. So when I started writing, I actually started writing, I think, like on a notebook or on a napkin when I was on the plane with my auntie's ashes. And I stopped off after I'd scattered her ashes. I stopped off at a friend's place in the Philippines, and I showed her these pages that I'd written. And she just said, "Oh my gosh, you have to write the book." And so I'd been writing as in taking notes, probably more for legal reasons than anything along the way during the court action against my dad. And I had to do a lot of discovery documentation. I sort of turned into a lawyer during that time. So I had written, but I hadn't sort of written for the cathartic pleasure of healing. And so, yes, writing has evolved and hopefully improved, over the course of the drafts of the book and as I was healing. And I think, yes, with the third book that I've just mentioned, which is about the healing journey, all of the healing modalities that I've pursued in search of the holy grail of being healed have all helped and informed my writing process. And so I think my style has remained the same. And I'm told that my book reads like a novel, that it's, you're sort of there. The immediacy of it is kind of journalistic in a way, but it's also written in quite a filmic way too, which is probably why it's been picked up for film. So does that answer your question a little bit?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Any more questions from the audience?
Thank you so much for your talk. So many of what you said gave me goosebumps and was so inspired. But I wanted to ask you about like the research process for this book and processing all these stories that you've heard growing up. I've been trying to research my own history from my Chinese diaspora family, just for my own personal interests. And for me, it's been hard to like read what my grandparents went through, all these powerful things. So how did you kind of reflect on that and research? I know you talked a little bit about it, thinking about your dad.
Are your grandparents still living?
My grandmother.
Yeah, I would suggest, so when I was much younger, when I was starting my journalism, I actually we had these things called mini disc players in the olden days, like in the early 2000s or 90s. And I sat down with a mini disc player and I interviewed some of the elders in my family. I interviewed my grandmother, I interviewed my Auntie Theresa. I think I tried to interview my dad, but he was very difficult about it, so we didn't do the interview. And even though I said it was all about him, which you know, if you know his character, he loves it if it's all about him. So what I would say is that these days you've got your phone and you can just record on your phone. Like I would sit with your grandmother and just have it and have a list of questions in mind and just say, I just want your story and just record it. Like that is the best place to start. And you find, well, I don't know what you will find, but I found that when I was interviewing the elders in my family, that first they say they don't think it's important. They're like, why would you want to know that? And is this the sort of thing that you want, or you want to know what I ate? Really? Like just and then things once they start talking and once the memories come, then the most beautiful, wonderful stories will come out. And then of course, you know, on the other hand, there is the research that you're talking about, which is reading history books, doing a lot of Googling, and then trying to cobble it all together. And when you do that research coupled with the actual interview with your grandmother and with your parents as well, because that would be a wonderful thing for you to have for your own interest, but you might end up writing a book too one day.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Anyone have any? Oh,
So you said you were writing this to like begin to heal, right? And you were kind of writing it to be therapeutic and bleeding, as you said. I'm wondering, there's a phrase that writers use is like, don't write from a wound, write from a scar. And I'm wondering with your book, when did you realize like, and maybe you were still writing from a wound. Maybe the book reads as a wound, but I actually probably think it's being picked up because it's writing from a scar. And I'm wondering if there was a moment in the writing process where you're like, I have processed enough of this where like I can tell the story and like it be out in the public.
Wow, even up to the last minute, even a week before it was about to be published, I said, are you sure that people are going to find this interesting? And could we just change my name? So in answer to your question, I think that it will read as being, well, I hope that it will read as being written from a scar, not a wound, but I think that wound was still open during the writing process, but I checked in with myself enough. And I think the journalistic side of me, the journalistic part of my brain clicked into place as well, knowing that I needed to show a degree of impartiality with my writing, because I didn't want it to scream, I'm the victim here. I wanted it to be able to be, one, it was a therapy for me, but I wanted whoever picked it up to be able to see a bit of themselves in that and maybe to feel supported in whatever they were going through. I got when it did come out, an extraordinary Instagram message from a reader who had found my book in Bali in a hotel lobby, and it had already, he said it looked like it had already been read 2 or 3 times. He said he picked it up and read it, and he said, I'm writing to you because you saved my life. Because he was in Bali to scatter the ashes of his nephew who had just taken his own life. And the uncle, he felt like he just wanted to paddle out on his surfboard and not come back again. And he said, I found your book. And he said, you saved my life. I just had to write to you just to let you know, because I was feeling really, I was having really, really dark thoughts, and reading your book and, the light and the colour and the humour that you bring to these dark periods of your life, really lifted me up. So, and I'll never forget that email. The messages that I've received from people have made, opening that wound and sharing it with the world really worth it.
any more questions? Okay.
Thanks for the book. I really like the book and for your talk. I have a question about your therapy eventually. Maybe two questions, but questions like I was just getting more and more angry with your father the more I read. So, but it seemed like even then, well, it seemed like in the beginning, what you said, there were like three ways to handle trauma, right? So you had to maybe choose to forgive. But I'm wondering if you had to, if you were able to forgive him before you did all the therapy, or you had to do the therapy first. And then the other question about therapy is just, or the mindfulness, is it religious based or is it not really specifically religious?
Great, two questions. So, the first one regarding the therapy, I was having counselling sessions when the court case was going on, because it went on for probably was a year or so or something. But and there was one session that I had with my therapist, and that session allowed me to really get to that point of forgiveness. And what she did, it's called, I can't remember the name of the therapy, somebody might know, but it's like attachment therapy, and it's an exercise that she did with me. And I'd be going into her every week, every second week, saying, and now my dad's done this, and now this is happening, and now he's lying to the tenants. And she would very patiently sit with me, take me through different methodologies and exercises I could do. This time I sat down, and she'd obviously been thinking, how am I going to help Mimi this time? And she said, imagine your father is at one end of a rope and he's dangling it off a cliff and you're hanging on at the other end and he's shaking the rope. What do you do? And I said, well, I negotiate with him. I try to climb up the rope. I've got this tactic where I'm going to put the rope around my foot. And she just kept saying, no, Mimi, no. And I was like, well, what do I do? She said, he's shaking the rope. And anyway, I did not come up with the right answer, I have to say. And my poor therapist sat there and she said, Mimi, just let go. And I was like, and so in my mind, we let go of the rope. And I literally sat in her chair in her therapist's office and I just felt myself falling through space. And it was just the most amazing feeling. And I let go. I really, I let go metaphorically, I let go emotionally, I let go. And from that point, he no longer was able, it could still irritate me, but he was no longer able to affect me to a great extent. And so I think that definitely then played out in my writing. And in terms of any religion, I don't ascribe to any religion because I think a religion and spirituality are two separate things. Religion is, of course, the man-made construct of churches and different ways of thinking. But I do feel a great affinity with Buddhism. And I think that the mindfulness and the Buddhist teachings really go hand in hand, although the mindfulness meditation that I practice and that I'm being taught, it's meant to be purely secular, but a lot of Buddhism teachings come into it. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I feel like we should have you back to give us like a meditation workshop, like not yet, but yeah, I feel like we're just learning, keep us learning with the audience, talk about how you dealt with information. But that's another way, of course, by the book, you haven't, because it's indeed kind of therapeutic as you're reading through it. And also for our virtual audience, I know we don't have questions from the virtual audience, but also if you would like to, come visit the museums, if you the next time, we'll have the books, all autographed by Mimi so that you could pick a copy, from our bookstore, the next time you're in town. But any last questions? Yeah, and then we'll go into kind of a short reading, and then wrap up. Yeah.
Hi. When reading the book, I was wondering why, or how in publishing, thinking about characters or opinions, like who was with having a wider target audience, like why you picked to go that way, like not having characters or tones.
Can you just rephrase the question?
I guess so. When thinking about publishing it to a wider audience or thinking about a wider audience, I was wondering, was there a reason why you picked the way you wrote it in the book.
Are you saying like Chinese characters and so on?
Yeah, for opinion, when you had the phrases in the book.
Oh, I see. Yes, because I had the Chinese phrases. Yeah, so when I did the audiobook, I had to get a Chinese friend of mine I recorded her saying the Chinese phrases with the right intonation, and I still didn't do a very good job. I had relatives around. I've actually discovered a whole lot of choir relatives around the world from this book coming out, and I did get a message saying you didn't pronounce this, I listened on audio. Thinking, which relative of my dad's are you? But in terms of, I suppose because I have that mixed race background as well, and because I've been really immersed in white culture in Australia and working for, a dominant white culture media organisation, I guess I've always been quite conscious of writing or presenting for the audience. And so really understanding who that audience is. So I think I wanted it to reach as many people as I possibly could. And I think that, hopefully I've succeeded in doing that by trying to marry together my limited Chinese knowledge and my sort of Western Australian experience. Thank you. That's a great question.
Great, so maybe before we go to the book signing, would you like to share?
I'll read a couple of pages. I'll just grab my glasses.
Yes.
So, as a few of you have read the book, I don't know whether you've got any favourite spots, and I don't know. See, it's interesting. In Australia, the book is published in a bigger format, and I think they've changed some of the page numbers. So I can't just go. Well, just go to the frame. So how about I just read a bit of the beginning of the book? The prologue. Okay. Grey hair like Marie Antoinette, it can't really be possible, but as I examine the phenomenon in the bathroom mirror, there's no denying I went to bed without any grey hairs, and now a brittle coarse sprig of them is right there on my scalp. The cause is a letter from my father, the latest of several he'd sent recently. After finding it in the mailbox, I had ignored it for days on the kitchen bench, the piano, or the dresser, or shoved under the stairs on a stool next to the school bags. Then finally, last night, when the kids were asleep and my husband was watching TV, I opened it. The Supreme Court of Western Australia, Qua versus Qua. I had no words. All the strangeness in my life, the past I'd tried to put behind me, it kept coming back. Smoke wisps around my feet, the dragon. Dad was suing me. Now as I stare into the mirror, I have flashes of my child self from age 10, proofreading Dad's legal letters and court documents. They would stream through a dot matrix printer, perforated paper, swallowing every available space in his home office. I would catch the pages as they spewed out and guide them into neat concertinaed stacks. Dad was always suing someone, and as late as 1 a.m, he would come into my room and ask me to check his letters. Excuse me, I need to get this off tomorrow. He'd hand me a wad of legalese and I'd scour with my pen, returning it to him after I'd applied my system of placing an X in the margin at the end of the line to indicate a correction. If only I'd spent as much time studying as I had working for Dad. At least he prepared me for fighting him in the latest legal tussle. His combative spirit is perhaps natural for a man who has been through so much, but all the same, why would he do this to his own child? Qua versus qua is something I never dreamed could happen. Cortisol and adrenaline surged through me, survival response triggered since childhood, response passed down from my ancestors. My very existence, the very qua of me, is under siege, this time in the unfamiliar territory of the courtroom, which is Dad's patch, his dragon stomping ground. I'm a tiger running towards a fire, leaping into the flames, while I look behind me as far back as I can to ancient China near the Emperor's Palace in Beijing. The sky opens and the shaman's almanac, which he uses to predict all things, shows clearly beneath my wood tiger stars that it was always my destiny to be trapped in a battle with a dragon. And then the book closes, and all that remains are tendrils of smoke from great-grandfather's pipe and grandmother's cigarettes. There are whispers of, you are qua, you are qua. But even in visions, my family members repeat themselves. I am surrounded by their stories, flooding through windows and under doors, House of Qua tales curling round the leg of my chair, clinging to my curtains like Aunt Theresa's brushstrokes on silk. I watch a tree grow from my table, branches and twigs rapidly filling the room, blossoms blooming in sharp bursts of spring colour, like fireworks, like bombs, our family. From all the tragedy, silken threads weave together into a picture of survival, a banner of hope. Then a dragon flies from the tree and without warning engulfs the branches in flames. As the tree burns, the dragon disappears, but for his eyes lingering in the sky among the stars that said, I will always be exactly here, that we cannot escape what is already written. Of course, Tiger cannot help but stop to look at her reflection as she passes by water under a burning tree, beneath dragon eyes in the sky. This image of her and what she's endured may show her how she became so fierce.
Wow. So on that note, yes, give a round of applause to our wonderful guest, Mimi. And then if you do want to know what happens next, write a book.
Dun, dun, dun.
All right. Okay. So yeah, we will go into a little, book signing. Feel free to, come to get your book autographed and, then speak to, Mimi directly, share your stories. So once again, thank you so much. And also to our live audience, and virtual audience, thank you so much for joining. As I mentioned, we have more program coming up next week. We have book talk about Chinese Indonesian cuisine, with three, different cookbook authors. And then the following week, we have a Mid-Autumn Festival mixer where we'll actually offer a mahjong workshop. So if you're into playing mahjong, we offer drinks. So it'll be a good kind of a social event, right? And then October once again, our new exhibitions opening October 3rd about Asian American periodicals, and then the same week we'll have several programs from panel discussions to artist talk, and then to a magazine launch party. So yeah, please feel free to follow us, and then we hope to see you at the next event. Thank you so much.